Good afternoon. My name is David Andriozzi, along with my co-host Dan Morales, to present Rebuilding Penn Station, an update on the continued effort to renovate the current dated Penn Station in a way that honors the original legendary Penn Station designed by McKim Mead White, built in 1910, demolished in 1963. Dan and I, along with Elizabeth McNicholas, who is not here with us today, host these lectures and fireside chats in a way to move the dialogue regarding our built environment past the current style wars polemic. We believe strongly that regardless of style, people tend to save buildings they love. So without delight embedded within the DNA of a design, no building can be truly sustainable. Buildings should be in harmony with the culture and context in which they are built, but most importantly, they should delight the public that pass them. This presentation is co-sponsored event between the New England chapter of the ICAA, the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, Rethink New York City, and Beaux-Arts Atelier. Please note that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and answer some questions at the end of the presentation. We'll start by welcoming Sam Turvey, Chairperson of Rethink New York City, who then will welcome Richard Cameron, founding member of the Beaux-Arts Atelier. Welcome, Sam. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to all of the sponsoring organizations for having us at this noon Zoom, as I started minting it about 6 hours ago. In any event, we wanted to speak to you about the current state of Penn Station, which has been in the media for some time. I mean, frankly, it's been in the media for some 60 years since the original tragic decision to tear it down. And as we will see, it's not entirely clear what the path forward is. There's some positive events on the horizon. There's some more negative noise on the horizon. And part of this program is to try to help all of us figure out where we stand on things and how we might be able to get involved. Rethink NYC is an education and advocacy not-for-profit focused on transit and transit governance issues as they impact the broader society. And we have been keenly focused on Penn Station as part of our outlook on the broader region of New York. As part of that, we have been working for some time on the station itself at Penn Station, and Richard Cameron has been an apt ally with us. And while we're making a little change in how some of that's organized, we're here today to talk to you about three variations that Richard has on Penn Station. One, which you see on the left, which is Penn Station, very similar to the original, being placed on the entire two-block site where it was originally. The second, middle orientation, would leave two Penn Plaza in place for reasons that we'll talk about. And the third iteration is one where both two Penn Plaza and Madison Square Garden stay in place. There are pluses and minuses to each of these. There are levels of realistic to each of these. We'll talk about some of that. I'll let Richard get to that later. But let's get some of the context and what the current state of play is at Penn Station. Some of you may have seen that in November, President-elect Trump, in a phone call, probably the initial phone call with Governor Hochul, gave every indication that he would like to see a beautiful Penn Station again, and he'd also like to see our subways beautiful again. Now, depending on your political perspectives, you might be skeptical about that, or you might be very glad to hear that. I can't comment on that, except to say that I am glad that Penn Station is on the President-elect's radar. It should be on his radar, and it certainly should stay on the Department of Transportation's radar, because we believe matters at Penn Station, whether they're from a transit standpoint or an architectural standpoint, are profoundly important, and that we have the opportunity of this century to get something really right at Penn Station if we press forward. The once and future Penn Station, Governor Hochul. Governor Hochul was at a business forum sponsored by Cranes recently and indicated that she'd like to see a Penn Station as magnificent as the Moynihan. That's a high bar. Some of us use Grand Central or Washington's Union Station as a bar, but the Moynihan certainly is a welcome addition to the cityscape in New York. Governor Hochul has made recent comments, as recent as June of 2023, that she would welcome design proposals for Penn Station from any architect, any design firm, and any engineer to afford them the opportunity to compete for a position to create a world-class masterpiece. We've been working hard to hold her to that. We think that's the right result. We will talk about some of the other proposals there are for Penn, but we think great things can happen there, but they need to be put into the public dialogue and fully and fairly debated. So what is Penn Station? Most of you know this, but I like to start with some of these pictures. This is the famous night shot of Penn Station. And to the right is a painting that frankly a friend of mine did to try and give us Penn Station in color and to give a little sense of what it might have looked like, with all the hues and the full palette of what was going on there. We'll talk a little bit about the surrounding neighborhood. Obviously, sadly, to all of us, on the left-hand side is the Hotel Pennsylvania, a McKim Mead White building that is now gone. It had an Ionic colonnade in front that met up with the Doric colonnade at Penn Station's exterior and the Corinthian colonnade at the post office. It's sad that composition has been, two-thirds of it are gone, but there are those of us that have no quit in us are going to try to hold together the best of what we can. Who do we have to remind us what happened? You don't always win, but sometimes you get a chance to be on the right side of history. And certainly Ray Rubinow on the left, Jane Jacobs, Aileen Saarinen, and Philip Johnson were on the right side of history in this one. And we want to do more than show up with signs at places. We'd like to win and make sure we get the best Penn Station possible. Now, the past 60 years since the station went down have been anything but solitude, to borrow from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And there have been a lot of fixes done at Penn Station. I'd really be interested in knowing how much they've all cost, because they, frankly, I think are throwing good money after bad. And even some of the things we're hearing about recently are throwing good money after bad. We need a more comprehensive fix at this station. The Band-Aid era should be over. The best example I give of the Band-Aid is at one point when they fixed up the New Jersey Transit Terminal, they built some sort of diorama that had an Atlantic City rowboat go around on a conveyor belt. Well, that broke and they left the rowboat sitting there for 2 years. I think it since has been removed. And what better symbol of how futile some of those half measures are. There are two things more recently that are staring at the station. One is Penn expansion. The railroads, Amtrak, the MTA, and New Jersey Transit, would like to demolish the neighborhood to the south of the station to expand track capacity for a New Jersey Transit terminal station. Terminal station would not run through to Sunnyside, but trains would terminate there. The reasons we don't have to fully get in today why that is highly inefficient and wasteful, but it's something that they intend to do. And that would eliminate all these buildings with yellow X's. I'm speaking to a group of architects. Many of these buildings are by some of the most famous architects in the world. The smokestacks building here is the original McKim Mead White power station. While the smokestacks are gone, the building is still there. It certainly could be adaptively reused for something special. The church there, and I would really encourage you to visit it, is by Napoleon Lebrun. It is a sensational church, and it is a very, very active Catholic parish that serves the poor, is well attended, and is not one of these empty churches that the diocese should be thinking about letting go. 7 Penn Plaza to the left, on 7th Avenue on the west side, and the Stewart Hotel on the other side are also by some of the finest architects we've ever seen. What you don't see here is another building with a bullseye on it, is the Daniel Burnham Gimbel's building. I think most of us agree that Daniel Burnham was not a hack. And the Gimbel Sky Bridge, which was featured in Steven Spielberg's West Side Story, is also at risk. And that's something that Christopher Gray called the Chartres Cathedral of sky bridges. So regrettably, we've lost the original Penn Station. We've lost the Hotel Pennsylvania, but we hope to be able to preserve the best of what's old in the neighborhood, which isn't to say we're unwilling to see new things happen. But we don't think that the wholesale replacement of this neighborhood with super talls, which we will discuss, is the right way to go. It's a variant on the Robert Moses mentality that we had hoped had been retired. Penn Reconstruction, as it's called, is the plan by the railroads to improve Penn Station. Originally, this was going to be a substantial improvement. More recently, we're hearing other things. We'll get into that a little later. This is when we get past just the building south of 31st Street, this shows you all of the buildings that are part of the New York State Development Corporation's general project plan, which was originally announced in 2020. And the purpose was a fewfold, but one of it was to provide considerable funding to the station reconstruction and the creation of a Penn Station southern expansion for New Jersey Transit. But there also was a thought that being that we're near a transit facility, we should have a bevy of high-rise super talls. This so-called Empire Station complex was largely going to be driven by Vornado. Early on in the process, Vornado put black signs up that called it a Vornado campus. And that was a little offensive, or a lot offensive to most of us. There has been some movement on that. That plan was originally put together by Governor Cuomo. Governor Hochul came in, spent a lot of time on a listening tour. I don't think she got to all the right people, but she did come out in November of 2021 and scale back the super talls. You can see the light blue at the top of these buildings. She scaled those buildings back, and she did, to her credit. However, I would suggest at an underwhelming level, add some affordable housing to the mix. And was at least trying to be responsive to some of the feedback she was getting. But I still think that what she is projecting is imbalanced when you think of what the real need is and how things should proceed. This should be a transit decision first, and everything else should build out from that. It shouldn't be a real estate development issue first. This idea, you can see Hudson Yards on the east. This whole idea meets the Empire State Development Corporation would like to have super talls from river to river. It's a messianic plan that is not how New York should be built. We're not Houston or Shanghai or cities that are like that. We have much more character, and we need to keep as much of that as we can. However, notwithstanding the governor's plan in 2021, it really couldn't take wing. COVID took place. The commercial real estate market has been in a real state of stress. COVID-19, I think most of us agree, has changed everything, and particularly the work from home phenomenon and the rush hour itself, the way people work, has changed forever. Now, how broad forever is, we don't yet know, but it's not going to be a small change. It's going to be a seismic change. And so in any event, I think the governor didn't like hearing about, from my organization and others, including the Empire Station Coalition, how devastating it would be to demolish these buildings. There are many affordable housing units there. There are many noteworthy buildings from an architectural standpoint and many small jobs. I've said many times, everybody's in favor of small jobs until they really need you. Then you're out the door. And I don't mind saying that the best way to make sure that there's affordable housing in New York is not to tear it down in the first place. So in any event, she decoupled the GPP, at least from the Penn reconstruction, funding the station. There have been some warbling in recent statements by the state's lawyers that the GPP stays alive and it will fund the Penn expansion. It wasn't that clear then, and a lot of these things are as clear as mud, but I just want you to hear the best read I can give you on it. It was at this press conference in June of 2023 that the governor made that comment I suggested before, that there should be an opportunity for architectural, engineering, and other firms to compete for a position to create a world-class masterpiece. There are a couple things I would suggest there. One is an openness to other work, which is who we are, and there'll be a number of others that I talk about. And we're also talking about a world-class masterpiece. We're not talking about a spit shine or a Atlantic City rowboat in a diorama. I think we're supposed to be talking about something much more. Strangely enough, Jano Lieber of the MTA apparently didn't get the memo. He downplayed the governor's call for the abilities of folks to compete for a world-class masterpiece and essentially asserted that the MTA had it covered. They'd consider other alternatives. to their plans, but frankly has shown very little compromise to his own positions. And this was hardly the spirit of the endorsement of the governor for the open competition that many of us are hoping for. Jana Lieber and the MTA doubled down on this in September of 2023. A lot of local elected officials, and not just local elected officials, Congressman Jerry Nadler, who you can see there, and Tony Simone, Councilmember Eric Botcher, Borough President Mark Levine. On the right, you even have City Club's Layla Law-Gissico. The folks came out and spoke about wanting a great 8th Avenue entrance, which we can talk about in a minute, but also talking about an RFP to really figure out how do we get this right and do the right thing. Lieber was dismissive of that. He crashed the press conference. He hadn't been invited. That's not my job to determine the politics of those things. But he very much said, we're engaged in a process, we're engaged with elected officials in the community to make sure that this is done transparently and in partnership with everyone. And I think these words transparent and partnership are really weak, as determined by the subsequent efforts of the MTA. This has not happened. The MTA has ignored Penn Station proposals from sources other than themselves. They even seem to be rejecting some of the recommendations of an architect they brought in named John McCaslin, who some of you are familiar with. He seems to be being sidelined, and they're coming back with something stranger. They also would like to shortcut the environmental review process. And as far as we're concerned, they've been complicit with the other railroads in trying to silence dissent on issues surrounding Penn Station. This is not going to work. If you look at Penn Station, they don't have funding. I've suggested in some of our materials that they're in free fall. And if you compare them to the Port Authority bus terminal that was struggling with the community at the beginning and still may be, but have come a long way towards, first of all, having an independent peer review done, working with the community, taking demolition of the neighborhood off the table. They are now look to be going forward with an $11 billion station project, and they're even giving back parkland to that area of the city that desperately needs parkland. That's a far cry from what we're seeing at Penn Station. And mind you, public engagement, yes, it's cumbersome, but in this instance, I think they're going to wind up with a much better result than they would at Penn Station if they would open their doors and listen. So in the wake of the governor's call for other proposals, and even preceding it, there have been a number of proposals out there, including rethinks. And I'll talk through these with you briefly, but on the top you have what is the most consistent rendering we have seen from the MTA. This does not reflect John McCaslin's work. I believe this is the work of FX Collaborative. And as they would have it, a long glass atrium would extend from 33rd Street, which you see in the foreground, to 31st Street in the backdrop. And this would bring light to the old taxiway that was between two Penn Plaza and Madison Square Garden. This is narrower than it looks, and it also is, and I've called this before, eyewash, because at the same time they're doing this, and if you look across 31st Street, you'll see various new buildings. You won't see the church or the McKim Mead White power station. They're going to have super tools around this entire area. I don't know when, if ever, this amount of sunlight would be reflecting down on 33rd Street like that. Now, they're not the only people who use eyewash, so I'll leave it there, but we'll move on. But one thing I do want to focus on is you'll see the truck down there next to the right, or what is the west side of that atrium. And that's a huge issue at Penn Station. Not only these loading trucks here, but on 8th Avenue, due to the presence of the Hulu Theater, there's constantly sound trucks out there, and that whole side of the street across from that great Farley colonnade and staircase is basically looks like a mechanical room if you look to the east. To the right is Vishant Chakrabarty's proposal for his firm and HOK. We think his designs are deserving of credit. We like ours better, but we certainly think his are deserving of credit, and he has spent a lot of time on this issue. He had a predecessor proposal that actually Madison Square Garden would have moved, but he has come back with this one, and there are a couple things I want to comment on. One, they would take out the Hulu Theater, which makes it possible to bring light down to the 8th Avenue side of the station and that's this centerpiece you see on 8th Avenue. That also takes the need for those sound trucks away. And suddenly you can begin to have something approximating a pleasant experience between the Moynihan and Penn Station. And I'd also like to credit and this is on behalf of the firm ASTM that Vashon and HOK are working with. I'd also like to credit them that their renderings show the neighborhood intact. And from the moment they came out, they said, look, we're a public-private partnership, and we do not need to tear down the neighborhood in order to do this. And so they've a lot of things going for them, and we need to give credit where credit is due. Another proposal down here on the left is from Alex Washburn, who some of you may know of. Alex has also been involved with the station for a long time. He worked with Senator Moynihan and had roles in the Moynihan conversion. He was in the design or leading the design efforts for the Bloomberg administration. He would have something more akin to the former 8th Avenue concourse, butting up against 2 Penn Plaza. But then he has a park very similar to Bryant Park behind the station and leading down towards the Farley Post Office. So this is a far cry when you're at the Farley Post Office, if you're ever allowed to sit on the steps. Looking across at this or looking to the west and seeing this, I have said this is somewhat similar to the Columbia University Quad, and Alex is to be credited for that. I also credit his efforts on behalf of the Grand Penn Community Alliance with showing these without tearing down the neighborhood. And to the left here is the McKim Mead White power station. Yes, there are no smokestacks, but it's nice to see it done that way. To the right is our proposal. We originally have been advocating for a few years to do a total rebuild of the original station. We've since, and Richard will talk about, proffered some alternatives. And this is where you can really see what happens if you have McKim Mead White on both sides of the street. Jeff Steichman, our renderer, did this. These are really, Richard has amplified what the 8th Avenue side of the station would be like due to the greater activity on the west side these days. But we think this is special. All three firms, the POW HOK firm, Washburn effort, and our effort, we all really would like to see an RFP and a design competition. We're very respectful of one another, although we each think we have the best idea. What a surprise! But we want to do better, and we don't include the MTA in that they have not been, that forthcoming, and we think that responsive. The MTA proposal will have no light coming in from the 8th Avenue side, and they will not purchase the Hulu Theater. And an argument can be made for that that's too much money to give to James Dolan or some other things like that. But it is not going to be inexpensive to correct the architectural crime of the century. And frankly, that's one of the less expensive alternatives than taking the whole 2 Penn Plaza and Madison Square complex down, which I think most of us agree would cost a small fortune. Now, the governor has put her GPP on pause, but I do want to emphasize that the railroads are still trying to go full speed ahead on building a southern expansion of Penn Station before 31st Street. Some of the most important buildings architecturally would be part of that mix. You have the Stewart Hotel in the foreground, 7 Penn Plaza, the church you can barely see tucked behind 7 Penn Plaza, but it's one of the crown jewels of the neighborhood. Here you can see something that is important in this area. There's these garment-centered deco buildings, a really interesting and eclectic set of architecture. If you get a chance to walk down 30th Street, take a look at them. They are really interesting. I feel for the people in this neighborhood. They're in our coalition. They both have the threat of the GPP, and if they get the governor to pull the GPP, then they have the railroads after them. We're very much fighting a two-front battle there. Now, one of the things I alluded to and I want to emphasize is that the railroads and EST efforts are sidestepping community review. Just like people scream about how much they love small businesses until it counts, these folks are screaming, we really believe in community input, but I don't think that's really true. And they've done everything can, some legal, some barely legal, some may be illegal, to sidestep local zoning and legal obligations, including the uniform land use review procedures. And in doing this, they're trying to trumpet the most recent faux community input effort they've created called the Station Working Advisory Group. Now, there are many terrific people and representatives on that group, but again, they carefully curate the agendas and carefully curate who gets to be on them. I'm not agitating to be on the committee. I don't think their agenda is going to be open to some of the ideas I have, and something needs to be done for that. Even worse, the railroads are advocating or agitating for a categorical exclusion to the NEPA provisions, the environmental impacts provisions of the environmental laws, in order to further insulate them from community reviews. And I believe also to stymie having to consider other ideas. So there's got to be some reconciliation on many counts as to what the governor is saying and what people are saying and what's really going on. That categorical exclusion is fairly offensive. What happens from all this chicanery? And other people say much worse things than I do. If you think I'm being a little tough, trust me, I'm being relatively tame. The railroads are offering Greater New York not much more than a handful of dust. They have no funding commitments for either the Penn expansion or Penn reconstruction. And yet they've come forward and said, we believe that the growing ridership needs from New Jersey are such that we're just going to keep this Penn expansion to the south on the table. One of the things that comes from that and leaving the original Penn Station as is they remain morbidly attached to Penn's existing barely legal layout and narrow platforms, which date from 1910. And they're rejecting adopting through running the modern global standard in commuting railroading. Now, we're doing a program on that. Rethink is next Tuesday evening, January 14th. We'll dig into that issue. There's so many issues in Penn Station. I'm trying to keep us on point, but I did want you to at least get the outlines of some of the things that are going on. So the governor says we're going to have a station as magnificent as the Moynihan. And I think it was the very next week. It was the Tuesday.
Sam,
Yes.
I'm just jumping in. We're about 30 minutes in right now. I just want to let you know.
I'm almost done.
Okay.
The railroads are claiming that we miscalculated the HVAC needs of the station, and we're going to need to spend almost all our money on that. We're not going to do a great mid-block train hall. We're not going to do a walkway to Herald Square. And they apparently intend to append 4 large towers to the exterior of Madison Square Garden. This doesn't square with what Governor Hochul and the president-elect are saying. So I just largely would close by saying we're mortified at the prospect of the Penn reconstruction amounting to a poor man's Pompidou Center, replete with building mechanicals and large HVAC towers, but likely minus the inventiveness and whimsy of the Parisian originals. So I'll close by saying we think an RFP is clearly warranted. We want to get these other design ideas, and there are good people putting a lot of time and effort into this, and we shouldn't come away from all this with a crummy and not barely an improvement. So I will turn it over to Richard, and thank you, David, for
thank you very much, Sam. That was fantastic.
Management. Hi, great to be here today, and I don't know, David, should I just
Yeah, just share away.
share away? Okay. And I just wanted to also say thank you to Sarah and the New England chapter of the ICAA, and David and Dan for doing this today. I just wanted to start quickly with the Beaux-Arts Atelier, which is something that had its origins at the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art back in 2011, 2014, as a way to try to revive teaching methodologies of the Beaux-Arts for students in architecture and art and design. And we recently relaunched it as a way to carry on this idea of design advocacy in the public realm, which is what this project has been about for me for all this time, and for the people working with me, with Sam and Rethink and so on. So this is the website. Quickly, you can go to it and see what we're proposing to do. We're focusing on design projects in the public realm, like the Penn Station project. This is, of course, this wonderful rendering from John Russell Pope for the competition for the Jefferson Memorial in Washington. And we're hoping to propose a set of projects which could be open to design competitions for students to work on, to put out ideas like this that can be launched into the public and then provoke conversation and eventually have an effect on what actually gets done. So, for instance, just on the design front here, this is the Penn project. And on the right, we've been thinking a little bit about Washington, D.C. and the mall and Charles McKim's original design for the mall for the Macmillan Commission, the Senate Commission for Washington, and also the way the Washington Monument has been left, just kind of landing on the ground with not much really going on around it at all, and proposing recently that we consider a competition to relook at the Macmillan plan, and particularly McKim's original idea of a formal garden surrounding the Washington Monument, creating a gathering place, which is, for now, there's almost nothing except for a lawn that doesn't get very well taken care of, and possibly even thinking about framing the Washington Monument architecturally. So these are just proposals that are out there on our website, and you can also flip over to the education side and see some of the original stuff from that studio back in 2011 to 2014. But I'm going to just share this and start this presentation on the Penn Station work. With the recent reopening of Notre Dame around the world, the French nation shared with us the importance of rebuilding our greatest structures. And after that terrible spectacle of the devastating fire, the recognition of the extraordinary work of the firemen, rescue workers who saved the building from total destruction, onto the dedicated team of architects, engineers, artists, and craftsmen before the celebration of the Mass, which was attended by leaders from around the world, was as inspiring as anything in recent memory for me and for many people. And despite the wars and conflicts, the optimism generated by the sight of this 1,000-year-old building, rebuilt for future generations of the faithful and visitors from every corner of the world, was palpable, and once again proved the value of the project of rebuilding. It took an act of strong and courageous will to resist the various projects to make novel additions to the building, and it left us with this extraordinary building once again. And I put it up just to, as I go through these slides on the idea of rebuilding Penn Station, just as a reminder, I went back to where the idea originated for me and those of us working on the very first issue of The Classicist, when the Moynihan Station project was announced. And we wrote an editorial and drew this cover for the first journal, in which the vaults of the original Penn Station were proposed above the post office as a kind of idea that we might, in fact, consider rebuilding the building in some way to kind of take away that terrible mistake we made when we tore it down and bring back the original McKim vision for the city and for the country. And over the years, that idea kind of grew within the originally in the Beaux-Arts Atelier when we were first sketching out this idea, and we eventually partnered with ReThinkNYC and started to work with Jeff Steichman to create a series of views of what might be on the site, accepting some conditions, not others. And this is a kind of series of variations of that, which I'm just going to go through and then open this up for discussion. And as Sam outlined, there are a whole myriad of issues to be considered here. Well, this was just trying to imagine the architecture of the original put back on the site and adapted for contemporary use. So there's Jeff's wonderful aerial view. And one of his earliest views for us, where we actually just showed the views it might be from 7th Avenue, and this of course is in the ideal circumstance of taking down to Penn Plaza, putting the station back and imagining it back in the contemporary city for everyone to use and enjoy, and bringing back McKim's great colonnades. And you'll see these as we developed these things further, we started to do full digital modeling of all of these things. But we started with these renderings, which you may remember. This in particular was a significant one working with Rethink, in which we addressed the issue of through running and widened platforms based on Rethink's plan under the original concourse to imagine what it would be like as a gateway to the city and, in fact, to the country arriving in here, as opposed to the current condition that we have on the site. And we also thought about adapting the colonnades along the side in various ways to make the building, to transform what was originally a building that faced 7th Avenue primarily, and its other sides were much less open and permeable, into open and permeable urban spaces that could accommodate various functions and allow ingress and egress from all 4 sides. And you'll see this developing as we get further into these digital renditions. And one of Jeff's views of the design adaptation of the interior of the station with more permeability on all sides, and the use of the ticket booths for so these were the original renderings that Jeff produced for us. And then this exterior rendering, which I particularly love, is that shows the adapted side of the building with these open loggias and colonnades, making 31st and 33rd Street more pedestrian oriented and open to ingress and egress into the station. And this view, which Sam put up earlier, which shows the way that the 8th Avenue facade would be modified to have a public-facing front across the street to the post office and the new Moynihan station. So keeping these buildings as an ensemble working together rather than something contrasting and in our view, harmonious, and bringing back all the elements of the original station. We then started working with Nova Concepts on digital modeling of things, first by creating a digital model of the original main waiting room, which you can see on Nova Concepts and Kent Liu's website, and on the Rethink website. It's animated and so on. So we did a fastidious rebuild of digitally in order to envision the space here. And along the way, we also were confronted with the question of, well, what do we do about Madison Square Garden? And so partly along that route, we did this drawing to show, and there are some more controversial ideas in here urbanistically, but the garden moved from its current site here over to a site on Broadway, and there are a couple of digital renditions of this. There it is there. We colored it in pink just schematically so you could see its location. There's the Empire State Building. There's Broadway coming down, so that the garden might move to here. The other possibility that was being considered by a number of people for the garden was, in fact, over at Hudson Yards, over in this, built over the rail yard over there. So this shows it looking from the west in that location. And then a sequence of these digital renditions that show how the rebuilt building, the redesigned building, would fit into the city. This is a view just looking across 8th Avenue with the new entrance on this side, new gallery space or library space or commercial space over here, which of course the original building only had a series of offices and small windows. So changing the face of the 8th Avenue elevation, you can see the Empire State Building there in the background. And here's a close-up of what that might look like facing across from Moynihan Station. These wonderful renderings by Nova Concepts. And this is a kind of some of the buildings pulled away. As you can see what the side elevation on 31st Street might look going all the way down and along to the left of the rebuilt station. And another, just looking back in the other direction, and and then down below, the full elevation of what that. So we really re-looked at the design of the building, the original building, and extended McKim's wonderful colonnades along the side, making this again much more open and giving this a full length from 7th Avenue to 8th Avenue with the focal point again on the original waiting room. We then were asking the question, well, if is it realistic or is it not to take 2 Penn Plaza down and put back the entire station? Could we imagine a variation where 2 Penn Plaza actually stayed in place? So again, we worked with Jeff on trying to envision this with the architecture sort of enveloping 2 Penn Plaza, and there's this aerial view of that, and one of the renderings that he made of a revised 8th Avenue. This is before they put the skirt up, of course. So we were imagining that you could potentially wrap the architecture around the existing skyscraper and leave it in place and bring back the great McKim colonnade. And then finally, this is a shot of the building of Penn Station itself, and the question arose, well, much more recently, what if we have to accept that the garden stays in place? Is there an architectural solution that still brings back Penn Station and McKim's vision for it, but also accepts the garden staying there, but re-envisions it as part of an ensemble that harmonizes together? And there you can see the location for the mid-block train hall. That was a construction photo, and there's an aerial view of the current situation on the site with all these accretions on the building, the precast concrete panels that are attached to the building, the compression ring that runs around here, and the tension ring that hold this kind of suspension roof structure in place. So we went back and thought about it, and in particular, I was also thinking about the fact that perhaps one could create a kind of capriccio that combined some elements of the original Madison Square Garden with the rebuilding of Penn Station, and produce a design which could harmonize together and recall other, particularly the original Madison Square Garden by McKim Mead White, and still have the same relationship to Moynihan and to the neighborhood. And so I did a set of, this is a diagram from another website that just shows the idea of taking away the Hulu Theater on this side and the zone for the mid-block entryway. And one of the things that was interesting when I started to just look at this was that it turns out that the original waiting room footprint actually fits perfectly in this space in the mid-block waiting hall. And so it occurred to me that perhaps you could have a recreation of the original main waiting room used as the mid-block hall. You leave Madison Square Garden in place. You build these new facades around the edge, and you use this as the base for the building. And that's how this and next set of renderings got done. And here's just an image of the original Madison Square Garden by McKim Mead White with these cupolas on the top. And that was the sort of inspiration, thinking that the towers which are on the site now, which house the escalators, could be rebuilt and used to create a new roof structure. So here's a kind of urban plan that's showing the elements in the neighborhood. There's the mid-block train hall inserted here with the new colonnades engaged with it along the side. This new entrance under the Hulu Theater, and the colonnades running north and south. That's the church that that Sam was referring to, there's even potential, I think, for opening up a park beside the church on the south side where that 1970s parking garage actually is. So a set of elevation studies of what this might look like, integrating these towers built out from their trapezoidal shape into a square with new structural foundations going down the extension of the building up to create this colonnade around the upper level. And the idea that we might then eventually open up the garden to having a dome. I was looking at their project for the Sphere out in Las Vegas and thinking like, well, you could actually open this up completely and make a very different experience inside the building. And the side elevation, which shows the colonnade extended along the side, mid-block train hall here with the vaults running in between the two buildings, the towers. And preliminary section, which we drew, which shows there's the main hall. And this, which would eventually, I think, would hopefully, come away. So you would either have two venue places, or you would open this up fully to the view of the dome up above. And there's one that imagines the colonnades wrapped down around 2 Penn again. So here's the view currently from the corner of 31st and 8th Avenue, looking across. This is the Hulu Theater stuff and so on. And a view that we created with Jeff Steichman, which he did a beautiful job rendering, showing that new 8th Avenue facade with the drum of the rebuilt garden up above it. And then, and you can see, again, similar, it's the same design we had from before when we had the full station adapted to this hybrid design. And then finally, the image that you have all seen circulating. And so we're now working on developing these with digital modeling and hoping to partner with an infrastructure firm and actually work on all the technical aspects of the design. Okay, thank you.
Awesome, Richard. That was fantastic. It's amazing. I think you came and visited us. You can take your screen. Yeah. You came and visited us in Boston probably 4 years ago, and just how this whole process has continued over the years. It's amazing. And I guess the biggest lesson for me is how, when we look forward to changing the context or adding fabric to our city, that it's important that we consider projects that actually relate to culture or people around them. And I'm not taking a position on the style, but as opposed to some projects which become just sculptural objects that go out of date. And I'll just say it as simple as that. So thank you both, Sam and Richard. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a couple of questions here. Dan, you want to start with the first?
Yeah, sure. There's a question from George Below. Apologize for the pronunciation. Who decides what, and who has the equivalent of the final cut?
That's a good question, and it's one that a lot of people have recognized, that I call it 6 characters in search of an author. There are 3 governors, there's the Department of Transportation and the 3 railroads, and then various elected officials. And trying to figure out a decision tree on this has proven especially problematic. And that may be in part why the Port Authority bus terminal, which has a more geometric decision structure, is making more progress with the public. What I have recommended, and I think Governor Hochul is probably in the best position to lead this, they've got a prototype, a decision tree that's geometric and appropriately puts the public interest first. That's not happening. I think presently we're along the railroads using technocratic feint maneuvers to insist on what they want, instead of us really looking at the big picture and grabbing the opportunity of the century that Penn Station represents, both from a transit standpoint and from an aesthetic standpoint. But I'm not sure that Governor Hochul it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Trump administration coming in. I think the Department of Transportation is probably going to have to take a big position in this based on the dollar amounts frequently coming from the federal government. And I think all parties, including the people, representatives of the railroads, acknowledge that there's something very wrong with the decision tree. Foster Nichols from the WSP firm has sort of Leslie Howard style, wistfully suggested, this really is in the railroad's charter to figure these things out. Somebody else does. And so we're going to be working on the somebody else and identifying them in the first half of this year.
A couple of people have pointed out that when you come into a train station, especially in Europe, you arrive at a place that has a certain genius loci, not genius loci in a vernacular sense, but there's a certain spirit when you arrive. Penn Station, the opposite of that, it's a hole. It's not only a hole, but after 9/11, for me, I find that as you go down those escalators, it's the scariest place to be in the world, just thinking about how vulnerable you are. And I ask you, Richard, when you compare this to some of the proposals, does does that situation get better beyond the lobby above, or is that really going to be always a problem of going down and underneath?
Well, I think as long as the garden is there, that, it's going to be an issue of, trying to get enough light and the experience of it. Obviously, if you create the mid-block train hall, and I think if you deployed the architecture of the original Great General Waiting Room, you'd have a spectacular entrance potentially with, still light getting into that part of it. I think the challenge, one of the advantages of building out the edges in the way that we're proposing, and it's lower than some of the other proposals, is the possibility to get skylight along the perimeter that could then penetrate down to the lower level, so that at least there you have some sense of the outside. I think that's why we, initially pursued the idea of rebuilding the original station completely, because obviously, that's the ideal in the sense of, you then have as much, and including for New Jersey Transit and the Long Island Railway at the eastern end of the site. You can introduce skylighting there as well, these variations are trying to deal with different levels of accommodation for what's on the site. But the ideal for me would still be, bringing back the original station.
So there's another question, which is sort of grabbing the bull by the horns. It's from Peter Primavera, and he says, please name other monumental buildings reconstructed in the world. And then rebuilding and reconstruction are fake, deceptive terms that do not exist in literature beyond the tiny community of classicists, Disney, anachronism. Please name other monumental buildings reconstructed in the world. So I would, off the top of my head, say the capital of Warsaw, and a lot of Dresden, Berlin, and that just really goes to the idea that places have an identity and people yearn for a place in this world, especially in America where life is very transient and anonymous. I would say that, what the character that New York has, it's famous around the world, is very much predicated on the buildings of this period in time. So there are many concrete examples that have been rebuilt 50, 60 years after the case. But as far as the Disney one, that's the old, tired argument that we were all taught in architecture school.
Yeah, I agree, Dan. There's the great cathedral in Moscow that was rebuilt after it was completely blown up, which they now have, services in. It's the cathedral for the city. There's Dresden, there's Warsaw, even Williamsburg in America, is not, I wouldn't call that Disney at all. I think, the idea was to try to recreate something. I don't know. I actually don't really understand the objection to this in that way myself. I think that, the palace in Berlin that just got, opened a couple of years ago is a good example.
Yeah, and actually, look, we have heard this, Richard before me and many others, and it's certainly a position, and it's entitled to be fully and fairly debated. But I can assure you that none of us are advocating for a building in terms of materials and workmanship that is on the circle at Epcot. That's not what we're thinking about. And I think there are all these great European examples. And in fact, I'm sure we have a lot of people on from all over the world from a group called Architectural Uprising, which are folks that are in various places advocating that traditional buildings go up, even where modern buildings had taken the place of traditional buildings. So, end users like myself, I'm not an architect or an urban planner. We also have rights and a point of view. And closer to home in New York, and I know sometimes Robert Stern generates the same sort of backlash, but they did a library up at the Bronx Community College, which is the former Stanford White campus of New York University. And there are some things about it that I think people have rightly criticized, but on balance, I think it is an absolutely wonderful adaptation, and I would really encourage anybody to do what I did one crisp September evening, was to go up there and walk around that campus. And you can compare and contrast it to the Breuer buildings, which are to the left, and decide which ones you like better. Now, to Mr. Breuer's credit, he did use some Roman brick in his construction, and then go over to Fordham University, and then go down to Arthur Avenue, have dinner, and you can reflect on all this. But when it comes to this argument, that's how I feel. And to the extent people don't agree with me there, I think if there's one exception in the world we should make, it's this building. And, I would put it to you, if a terrorist blew up Grand Central, would we take the position that we're not going to build the Grand Central back? We need an architecture for our time, and that was just so old news. We've done polling, and most of the public does not agree with the idea that if you blow up Grand Central, you can't rebuild it. And while the time lapse in this building from what happened in 1963 is longer, it doesn't mean we can't have an honest conversation and let the public determine, what, if the materials and workmanship are right, we're all for it. And that's how we feel about this.
I'm piggybacking on, I'm sorry to bring this up again, but you two probably can talk a little bit more about this. I mean, Penn Station, when it was originally built, was a symbol to the world. It was America's gateway to America, and it was seen that way. When people came, they're arriving in America, and that's more than architecture. That's an experience that you feel when you arrive. And I don't know why that's not being taken into consideration, aside from the style. Like, it's not showing up you have to show up someplace. We're showing up in America, but Gilded Age, the beginning of America.
So there's another great question. Could Sam please address why Moynihan Station doesn't replace Penn Station, and why Penn Station? I think that's the main question that I've actually thought myself.
It's an excellent question, and it's one people ask all the time. And in fact, many people say, why are you guys even still at this? You won. They rebuilt the Moynihan. Well, you got to start with their 600,000 plus commuters, and that does include a substantial amount of subway riders that go through today's Penn Station, and that's bigger than the population of Boston. And part of the reason the place is so harrowing for people like David is it really is the ultimate sardine can. So the Moynihan represented a creative and very good resolution of the national train problem, meaning that Amtrak, we now have a worthy national point of entry and departure at the Moynihan. It is not big enough to handle the 600,000 people that would need to go through there. It's probably big enough for 15 to 20% of it. And look, there's a guy named Michael Evans who had a lot to do with the Moynihan being finished. He really, really, really did everything he could to make sure that happened and make sure it happened well. And we think we need to find leadership and the effort to do something similar across the street. And it is really where the lion's share of the Penn Station traffic is. So Moynihan, we think, is terrific. But it's not enough. But what it does do is set a great architectural set piece for whichever great plan, and we do want to see a great plan for Penn Station is built on Penn Station proper.
Well, just to add to that, and also to what David was saying, one of the great things I love about Richard's plan is that it really is in dialogue with the old post office. And so you do have this set piece where you could bring back a piazza, if you will, a public entry space for the city, with the facade facing what is already there, the wonderful facade of Moynihan Station. And I just think of the tower in Venice, the famous Campanile that came down in 1913, and it was instantly rebuilt. There's an ensemble there to that urban space that is the one of the hearts of the city. Well, in that case, it's the heart of the city. New York has several, thankfully, many little beating hearts. But in terms of its central location, this would be it. And so you wouldn't think twice about rebuilding that Campanile to complete that civic space. I think here we have the opportunity to give the public, which I think this really needs to be emphasized. This is for the public. It's not for classicists. It's not for elitists. It's not for whoever. These buildings are a gift to the street. So I think that's what I really am excited about is the way the Farley Station pulls back from the street wall and creates a de facto enclosed space that when you would come out, you would feel like this feeling of New York will be repeated in Columbia University. It'll be repeated in the big famous buildings of Wall Street. It's a part and parcel of the character of the greatest city in America.
A couple of people have brought up the point of that you've been on this foulness for so long. How much of the original fabric? I know that the 22 Eagles, I think, are some out there someplace. Has there been discussion about fabric that's out there that could be brought back into the new plan?
Yeah, I mean, there are, as you say, the Eagles. There are pieces of the original Adolf Weinman sculptures at the Brooklyn Museum. There's actually a section of this has been turned into a fountain out in the Midwest. There's a proposal to bring that back. I mean, I think you would, rather than as they did in Dresden, you would repatriate as much of the fragment. The other thing, no one's really ever gone looking for any of the pieces that were thrown into the Meadowlands in New Jersey. And, if you really wanted to create a kind of archaeological approach to this, you could, in fact, try to bring back as many of those pieces as possible and either display them or actually, adapt them into the building, I think.
Somebody mentions the question of economic costs of this, benefits, but also costs of doing something, I'm assuming traditional compared to modern. And I have to bring this up is that it costs $25 billion to build Hudson Yard, and it costs $760 million to renovate Notre Dame. That's 30 times 33.
Right.
But I wondered just your thoughts on, and getting back to one of the original premises, if you build something that people will love, it will stay forever. So that in itself is an inherent quality of building it. So it's going to be loved and it's not sculptural and it will go out of date.
Yeah. Yeah. And this debate about rebuilding, I mean, there are so many aspects to it, but, you think about the Shinto temples of Japan, which get ritually rebuilt every, 25 years and are constantly renewed. I don't think I think the idea that that's somehow fake is just not real. The question of costs, the Port Authority is currently getting redone to the tune of $11 billion. They spent $4.5 billion on the Oculus downtown. The numbers are, and I don't think that the incremental cost of doing it in stone versus doing it in glass and steel, which you then is fashionable for a minute potentially, and that I don't think that the issue of cost is really the fundamental question here. It's the question of value. What are you going to build and what are you going to want to keep versus what you don't. And this is, I mean, depending on which one of these projects it is, it's probably a $5 to $10 billion project, including, I don't know, Sam, you maybe have a sense of it, but including all the transit issues. But then the transit issues expand out from the Penn Station site out into the entire region. So I think you have to be thinking really about what is the image you want and for the central arrival point into the city. Not that I'm trying to dismiss the cost question. I just don't think that it's actually really all that different.
There are issues within issues, and we could be at this for hours, but I would say this. Part of the reason we came back with 3 variations on the McKim ideas are that it's less expensive to not fight the battle of moving to Penn Plaza. There was some discussion between the MTA and to Penn Plaza about buying that building, but the MTA didn't move fast enough for whatever reason they did, and there's been a $800 million makeover, And I think there was more conversations, and then lo and behold, he's now got a lot of long-term tenants in there. So, there are cost factors there to think about. Same with the garden. Some cities pay to build arenas for people, others don't. So there's a whole host of cost components in there. But what I would say is, at present, the railroads are talking about building a subterranean station to the south for New Jersey Transit with terminal tracks, which are the most inefficient track pattern for railroads. Their federal rail regulations really think you should have through trains, which is the way Amtrak presently operates. And a lot of the trains presently operate, albeit they run through the station and sit in rail yards instead of doing things productive. Ourselves and advocates of other through running plans think you could save as much as $10 billion by modernizing transit instead of repeating the past. So there are monies to be available there. There are modern construction techniques that make classical building more cost effective than it could be. We think we can do this cost effectively to the other plans that have been presented. And apropos of what you're all saying, look, Grand Central Terminal is the second or third leading tourist attraction in New York. It is part of our brand. Can one building change the brand of a city? Some of you will laugh and think, why are you bringing this up on a classical architecture call? But the Sydney Opera House has completely changed the brand of that city. You don't even think of Sydney without that opera house flying into your cranium. So there's an investment to be made here. We think it can be done cost effectively and should be done cost effectively. And look, we're also, as same as we're promoting our plans, I always make sure that we have the HOK drawing in there. And we've had some of the John McCaslin drawings or impact drawings in what we've done. It just doesn't seem like that's what they're doing right now. As I said, right now they're going to do HVAC towers or bust. So we think we can and need to do better.
We have time for a couple more questions. One question came in is, Richard, have you thought about it without the dome? And before you say that, I don't want to knock on Mike Terrell, who I'm friendly with, who's making the question. But the first thing I saw when you renovated this with a dome is endless opportunity. One was that you would be in the arena looking up at that dome, and whether it would be translucent or whether it could be closable, as you mentioned, and with the clear story windows going around. But then also the idea of it being flat with some sort of an urban space or an arcade up there with an Oculus or something. There's so many different opportunities. It's endless opportunities with that shape, it seems.
I agree, David. Again, this, these were sort of conceptual ideas in order to try to think through what, could sort of iconically be there. Whether, you have to just be able to re-engineer the structural system to some degree in order to make that work, which is a whole, huge study on itself. But I kind of, as a composition, right, looking at it with the dome and the clerestory and the surrounding McKim Station, it seemed to me to be a great starting point for what could be quite extraordinarily transformation. If you're going to keep the garden in place, you want it to become something more than just what it has been already, and you're going to have to invest money in order to do that. You're going to have to reclad it, restructure it, and I think that the dome on the top would be a significant contribution to that. Could you do it without it? Yes, but I don't think it would be nearly as compelling as an experience and as a composition.
So another question is, can we still afford to build a classical building versus a glass box?
I think the simple answer is yes. I think
Yes. Next.
Well, I think there are examples of buildings. 9 West Street was, for instance, completely rebuilt after the World Trade Center event, and that great Cas Gilbert stone facade was actually all recreated and put up on metal framing. I think the simple answer is yes, you absolutely can. In fact, the ASTM project is in fact supposed to all be in stone. It's in fact, I think they're proposing it's in stone, rather like Lincoln Center or something like that.
Well, the other thing that it's almost impossible to calculate is the cost of maintenance of buildings that are done in glass, where the caulk joints blow out constantly, or like the East Wing Gallery in the National Gallery of Art by I.M. Pei, whose thin stone veneers had to be entirely replaced at an incredible cost. Those things don't obviously come through in the initial accounting of a building, but if it's a monument, if you're thinking about the importance of resilience and how cities are going to have to withstand a lot more climate stress in the future and where these resources are going to be coming from, I think building a little sounder and a little better and emotionally more impactful does really pan out. It just pens out or pencils out, just not today. And so that's one of the problems that we have for advocating this kind of building is that it's hard to show the bean counters, which I have to live by as well. I'm not trying to degrade that work, but there's an economic value. For example, in Paris, after von Haussmann, built out all these boulevards, they were as elegant as they were a bit boring at the time. And so the city officials around 1904 or 5 did a facade competition where they basically wanted to dress up these boring buildings, and then that's where you get those voluptuous bays and this and that. And the city itself said this is an integral part of the financial health of our city to have these, and he literally put it, Americans coming over and spending their money here. So I mean, as wonderful as Paris is, those guys were counting beans very much so in a way that we might call crass, but in a way in which sustains the economy of that city. So I'm not saying that this one building will do that, but it is part of that way of thinking that it isn't just about classicism or aesthetics, but about a place that you want to be.
I would say this. Let me just throw this in, Dave. Dave. I was a kid. I used to read the Scholastic Book Service's weekly reader in school. And when I was a kid, I read about falling water and a wooden sailboat called the Intrepid and Expo 67 in Montreal. And I went to all those places, and they're part of my DNA. If you were to do something as bold as any of the variations Richard is projecting, it will become a story for years all over the world. And every quarter, kids who are now 5 will be reading about this, and you will be generating 5 generations of tourist activity that you can't even imagine. The brand impact of something like this would just be tremendous.
I would encourage people that aren't architects to look at 2 buildings, the Tuscaloosa courthouse that was recently built that is traditional and was very, very successful. And the in San Francisco, the federal building by Morphosis that was they had to save $11 million and eliminated $11 million by eliminating the HVAC system because it was over budget. So, and that's a glass box, and I think that it is equal. And again, getting to our earlier points, I think when you get something that's going to stay and be endless and timeless, then you get your cost back, and it's simply worth thinking about it in that way.
Yeah, I agree, Dave.
Thank you so much, Sam and Richard. I hope you come back again with further updates. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, the ICAA. This has been a wonderful presentation, and we will have it posted online, probably at both New England ICAA and Architectural Delight, hopefully by the end of next week. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.